Soviet authorities struggled on two occasions to confront the horrors of the past. Labeled amorphously as the repressions, it's a past that begins with Lenin, but is more closely associated with Stalin. It's a past that evokes the human dislocation, reign of terror, and massive loss of life inflicted by the state on the Soviet people. The first attempt to confront this past came in the years immediately following the death of Stalin by his successor, Nikita Khrushchev. The second attempt came 30 years later under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. What motivated these efforts to confront the past? Why and in what ways did they fall short? How has the rise of Putin's authoritarian regime been facilitated by these failed efforts? To delve into these questions, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Kathleen Smith from the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University to discuss her book, Remembering Stalin's Victims, Popular Memory and the End of the USSR. Kathleen, thank you for taking time to join this episode of Realms of Memory.
Thank you.
So to begin with, I thought it was interesting, your point of working through the past regarding repressions. The term repressions is pretty vast and vague. And I mean, how do you pinpoint what it exactly means and how many people it implicates and how far it goes? You had an interesting section in your book where you talked about how expansive this is. So I thought that might be an interesting place to start, just to provide a little context.
So I think your adjectives vast and vague are really appropriate here because that term repressions is used to describe this huge wealth of, unpleasant, horrible things that took place in the former Soviet Union. And, the Soviet Union had an extremely violent 20th century, if you think about it, starting with entry into World War I, the revolution, civil war, consolidation of this often brutal communist regime, and where you kind of pin this moment in which the Soviet state turned repressive, it is kind of a litmus test for Russians sort of about their politics. And typically, this term is used to describe Stalin's repressions, which is a way of kind of not examining the pre-Stalin years, the early, perhaps more romantic years of the Bolshevik Revolution, and also a way to draw a line between Lenin and Stalin. So if the repressions are a mistake of Stalin, then you can talk about, if you're a communist, reinstilling Leninist norms, going back to the original ideals of the revolution and so forth. But in modern times, many researchers date the violence, all the way back to 1917. So it is a very expansive term, and I think it's almost a necessity because of the range of, sort of state-sponsored violence, to use modern language, that was carried out by the Soviet state against its own people.
How many people are implicated? I mean, is there even a definitive number of how many people were affected?
Yeah, there's no definitive number of victims. And I'll give you an example of some of the sort of big pieces of the Stalinist repressions, and you'll see why there's no accurate count. So often under this umbrella term falls, for instance, the campaign against kulaks. These were Russian peasants who were considered to be wealthy. Now, by our standards, they were not that wealthy. We might have called them successful peasants, but these were people that maybe hired extra labor, that owned several horses, that had, substantial dwellings and so forth. So part of Stalin's policy towards the countryside was to promote collective farms. Peasants on a whole were not that interested in this notion, and ultimately the Bolsheviks relied on poor peasants to be the backbone of the new collective farm, and they disenfranchised, often expelled, arrested wealthier peasants, and drove them out of the villages. So this is a process that took place, in many provinces with lots of variation. It's really impossible to go back now and try and count how many people were victims of that, or to essentially assign the blame, to identify all the perpetrators.
Because you're not talking about the gulag, right? They're just disenfranchised from their farms.
They were disenfranchised, some were arrested, and many were exiled. So they were loaded on, carts or trains or barges and shipped to sort of relatively unsettled parts of the Soviet Union where there was a need for forced labor. And they were not allowed to leave those settlements. So you're right. It's not our typical sense of the gulag, but it was a form of, not quite imprisonment, right? But forced labor, restriction of rights. And because the conditions in these places were so poor, right, that people were shipped off with what they could carry, they often froze, starved, didn't survive the first winter. So again, maybe the centerpiece of Stalin's repressions is the traditional sort of gulag narrative. Someone is arrested for a politically inappropriate conversation and, is sent to a camp in Siberia and so forth. But again, this topic of repressions is so vast and so sweeping that you have to allow for different population groups being involved. And I think that's partly why there's never going to be an accurate count of how many people were affected by Stalin's repressions. I am not someone who is a quantitative political scientist. So I often just say, the answer is millions. And when you get up to millions, I'm not sure how much more it matters to know specifics beyond that.
The kulaks, the wealthier farmers, but you also had whole ethnic groups, right, that were deported as well.
Yes. So before World War II, there were security fears on the Western border. There were groups of Poles, Germans, Jews, other ethnic groups, Ukrainians that were deported, sometimes just, say to the other side of the Ukrainian Republic, sometimes farther to Central Asia. And then during World War II, Stalin was very suspicious that certain ethnic groups he thought would collaborate with the Germans as the Germans, really rapidly occupied large swaths of Soviet territory. So from the Caucasus, the Chechens, for instance, were deported. From Crimea, the local Tatars were deported to Central Asia. So again, this isn't the classic gulag tale, but it is a part of this really ruthless, centralized state, assigning collective guilt in a way to whole groups. And in all these cases, the state is short on resources. So, they're putting people in boxcars and shipping them off to locations that are not really set up to handle a huge number of displaced persons. So there's a high death rate that accompanies all these deportations.
Is the famine that happens in the Ukraine, is that just part of the larger process of collectivization, one of the outcomes? Or because I thought that was interesting, you mentioned later on that when people look back on the repressions, that in some areas, it's really seen as, by some nationalities, it's seen as a form of genocide.
Yes, and I will be the first to admit that I am not an expert on the topic of the famines. There were this great famine that hit Ukraine, parts of Russia, and Kazakhstan. And it's very contentious whether this was ethnically targeted, as many Ukrainians, for instance, say, or again, whether this is a incompetent state that has, little energy or little concern for its citizens at some level.
And when you refer to the repressions, it's not just what happens at the time, right? It's the aftermath, right? Because it's something that seems like it carries on long afterwards. There's a ripple effect, right? That affects the children, right, of parents who are executed or sent off to prison, right? That the people who are stigmatized afterwards, that it casts a long shadow.
Absolutely. So let me say a little bit about sort of, what the classic kind of story of Stalin's repressions is and how that had a long shadow. So the most well-known piece of this sort of violent Soviet history is often referred to as the Great Purges. And it began in the mid 1930s after the assassination, which was very possibly a staged killing of a major party figure, a fellow named Sergei Kirov in Leningrad. So this assassination was interpreted or publicized by the regime as an act of terrorism. And it triggered a whole campaign against class enemies, saboteurs, political rivals, etc. It figured in show trials against Stalin's rivals that took place in the 1930s. It became a pretext for gutting what legal protections people had in the Soviet Union. They secretly, for instance, allowed the secret police to use torture to obtain confessions. And Stalin, in this moment, essentially said to the secret police, you guys are like 5 years behind in fighting the enemies of the state. And that mobilized the secret police to really look for enemies everywhere. And so when you think of ripples, I would say, first of all, the purge itself had ripples. You arrest one person, you start looking at that person's connections and relatives. And, often wives were arrested and they were charged because why had they not turned in, their husband for, say, anti-Soviet beliefs? And these were innocent people. So the wife is saying, well, he never said anything bad about me. I didn't know anything about this. But that was not an acceptable excuse. So these purges rippled through workplaces, communities, families, etc. And then, as you said, the stigma attached to the children as well. So if your parent had been convicted of anti-Soviet activity and sent to the gulag or executed, at every workplace for any institute of higher education, you had to fill in a form and share that information. And so it was really a black mark that kept people, essentially at the margins of society once this terrible fate had struck their family, or they covered up that information. But once you cover up that information, then you're already guilty of a crime, right? So that was a very difficult decision to have to make.
So in that black mark, does that affect you? You're trying to find a job or trying to find an apartment. Does that disadvantage you in real ways?
It was a huge disadvantage. So maybe not so much in finding housing, but in finding employment or holding on to one's employment and in receiving education. It also was a black mark, to be honest, in things like finding a spouse, right? Do you want to marry someone who has this stigma? Associate yourself with someone who has this dangerous past that might, reach out and affect your future children as well. And it's interesting, Gorbachev, for instance, doesn't talk about this, but he had two grandfathers who were briefly subject to the repressions. His grandfathers actually survived. But his wife, Raisa, one of her grandfathers was also, arrested and did not survive. And one wonders at what point in their courtship they shared that information with each other. But it is something, in later years that he disclosed that they both shared this experience of having that trauma within their families.
Okay, so you have this horrendous past. Stalin dies in 1953. Why not just take the Spanish approach and put a lid on it and move on? Why address this at all? Why did the leadership feel a need to work through this in any way? And then when they do, why is it such a difficult thing? Why can't they use it to their advantage? Like you mentioned that this is something that a lot of regimes can use to start fresh, to draw a line between themselves and the previous regime, to establish their own legitimacy. Right? You use this term inverse legitimacy, right? That you can contrast yourself, your regime, with a previous regime, and put yourself on a more credible footing. So why address this to begin with? What's the need? And then when they do, why is it so problematic? Retroactive justice. Why can't they? Uh, why do they struggle with doing this?
That's a great set of questions. And I will tell you that I find that decision by Nikita Khrushchev, one of Stalin's heirs, so to speak, to make his famous secret speech in which he denounces certain aspects of Stalin's policy and admits, that there were these unjust repressions, again, to use that word that the Russians always use. I mean, I think that's such a fascinating topic that that was the subject of my most recent book, which is called Moscow 1956, that just takes a deep dive into that year where Khrushchev makes that choice. But I'll give you the short version. The short version is that at first, the reaction is, as you predicted, to just not say anything, to try and, not discuss what's happened. And I'll say here that, again, you have to think in the Soviet Union, right? Even the leaders themselves didn't know what public opinion was because the, strictures on free speech were so strong. So as Stalin was dying of a stroke, his heirs mobilized the Moscow garrison, put the soldiers on alert because they literally didn't know how people would react. Now, people reacted in a way that the leadership preferred. That is, they were sort of knocked over by grief and distress and were worried about what would come next, and turned out in huge numbers, to go and view Stalin's corpse as he laid in state and so forth. But what do you do if you're now in charge of running the country? And this great figure who has been, the center really of Soviet life is dead. In my book, I write about there being a sort of period of silent de-Stalinization. And in this moment, without making public announcements, you can see the leadership start to dial down some of this cult-like following of Stalin. So, you don't have to quote Stalin in every speech. Suddenly his birthday is not a huge national holiday, etc. So that takes place in the public sphere. And certain messages are sent. So before Stalin's death, there was a new wave of purges starting, a very anti-Semitic sort of targeted purge against Jews. And at the center of this was the so-called doctor's plot, where some famous surgeons and medical professionals were accused of having poisoned Soviet leaders. So after Stalin's death, there's an announcement in the newspaper that this information was incorrect, that there was not a conspiracy, and that evidence had been obtained by illegal means. So that's kind of a signal to the public that, we're not going to use the secret police to kind of torture false confessions out of people anymore. And so even though it caused a lot of confusion with the ordinary public that didn't quite understand what was going on with this, I think it was an important signal. But then, the question is, can you just continue without addressing the past? And as you mentioned, I use this term inverse legitimacy. I think ultimately Khrushchev decided that it wasn't going to work for the party to make serious changes in Stalin's policies without somehow criticizing Stalin. And he came to believe that the party could, in fact, kind of benefit by being more open and admitting to its mistakes, and that this would restore people's faith and enthusiasm and allow the party to go forward with like a newly committed populace behind it. So that, I think, is the positive spin that Khrushchev put on this. Now, not all of the leadership agreed with him. On the contrary, most of them had a lot more trepidation, I think, knowing that the first question that would arise would be, well, where were you when Stalin, was carrying out the purges or, framing his rivals and so forth? Because all the people at the top of Stalin's system got there by being loyal to Stalin. So they were all implicated in this. And, only Stalin had passed away, right? The rest of them are still standing. And so it became a problem to essentially break with the past without breaking with the people of the past, essentially making Stalin, sort of the one scapegoat for what had happened.
But he's not the only scapegoat, right? There are others who were targeted right off the bat. Right?
There were people from the secret police that were targeted right off the bat. In fact, many of your listeners may have seen the comedic film Death of Stalin, where it, with not entire historical accuracy, points out that the first thing that the survivors do is they all kind of turn on the secret police chief Lavrenti Beria, because one thing that unites the rest of the party members is that they're tired of having the secret police be so powerful. So Lavrenti Beria is arrested, accused of a whole array of crimes, some of which he definitely did, some of which, like being an agent for the British during the Russian Civil War, are like extremely unlikely. He had a closed trial and he was executed. So essentially they dealt with Beria in a Stalinist way. And then after that formed sort of a collective security pact of, we're not going to do that to each other anymore. That we'll have a more peaceful form of politics at the top.
How do you critique what came before without undermining the entire system, right? How do you do this in almost like a surgical way?
Yeah. And you see, during this brief thaw that follows, that there are these sort of clever critical thinkers who are saying, well, you're saying that Stalin created a cult of personality in which he took credit for everything and everything was up to his decision. But the way that you're now deposing him is like a cult of personality in reverse. You're saying it was all up to him. And that's not realistic, right? He had these agencies and institutions that were working for him. If you're telling us this, we don't want this to happen again, what are you doing for institutional reform? Or, where is the investigation or the trial or what have you? But that kind of speech was unacceptable to the party. And people who tried to make a systemic critique were very quickly silenced, including already, by the end of 1956, there were young students who went to prison for, calling for a real settling of accounts.
I mean, is Khrushchev doing anything different in 1956 that hadn't already happened in 1953? I mean, isn't he still pinning the blame on Stalin and a few people and really not looking beyond that?
I agree that that's the case. I mean, I'm a political scientist by training. And so when I look at this, I say, well, he didn't really upset these institutions. He didn't, say, reform the entire court system, et cetera. You can see all these shortcomings. But I do think that he did something really important and something that needed to be done for there to be any hope of reform. And that is, he admitted that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was fallible, that they had made a mistake. And in a way, it kind of breaks the spell in which you couldn't criticize the party at all. And what Khrushchev says, and this is echoed and implemented at a much larger scale by Gorbachev, some 30 years later, is that the party needs constructive criticism. If you really support the party, believe in its goals, then you can be part of a constructive conversation. And he compared this to Lenin. He said Lenin, persuaded his opponents of why his policies were correct. And Stalin purged his opponents. So again, he's sending a signal that times have changed, that this is going to be, the Russians joke about this, they call it a vegetarian era. So, you can get in trouble, but, it's a vegetarian era. You're not going to be executed. And once that happens, right, the possibilities for more free speech really rise. Now, the regime is not really clear about what the limits are, and that makes the rest of the year 1956 and indeed the whole thaw a very bumpy process, as you have writers, intellectuals, other people kind of testing the limits of reform, and the limits are always set by above. So, sometimes you push the limits and you pay for it.
And there's pushback, right? So there's pushback throughout from within the party and even among intellectuals.
Yes. So there is a strong sentiment among members of the party elite, but also some members of the public, that the most important aspects of Stalinism were success with industrialization and collectivization and the victory in World War II. And some of them admit that there were excesses, that the purges happened, that the party could have been, more gentle, etc. But ultimately, they think that it was worth it, that the ends do justify the means, and that essentially these, black spots on Soviet history are, just going to be exploited by the Soviet Union's enemies, and therefore one shouldn't have to talk about it. So, yes, make a decision. We're not going to do this anymore, but why air one's dirty laundry, so to speak? And so there's constant battles over what can be published, what can be said. I mean, Khrushchev's speech in the West, we call it the secret speech. And that's because it was made initially to a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, so these party elite. And they were not allowed to, have a copy. It was not published in the Soviet Union until 1989. But it wasn't an entirely secret speech, because once Khrushchev had delivered it and thought that it went all right, he pushed home the point that party members need to know this. And, young communists need to know this. So he initiated a campaign where the speech was printed in a small edition and sent out to party leaders across the Soviet Union. And they then went and read it out loud at meeting after meeting after meeting, so that people would be informed of what Khrushchev had said. And I didn't know this when I was writing Remembering Stalin's Victims. Gorbachev himself was at that moment a young sort of party employee back in his home region of Stavropol. And he was one of the people tasked with going through the countryside, convening party meetings, and reading Khrushchev's entire secret speech out loud. So in some ways, I like to think maybe he was setting himself up to be a reformer, because he was literally standing in Khrushchev's shoes and delivering this denunciation of Stalin over and over again.
Well, that's fascinating, especially because that point you make later on, that he seemed to be like, it's almost like you're struggling to understand. Well, how could he have been part of this 20th Party generation? Because he seemed to be so detached from that history. He seemed like he couldn't understand it. He couldn't understand the pain, the popular reaction, and he's out there personally delivering this message.
Yes. And I mean, I suppose one could say that maybe he had dealt with his trauma to a large extent, and, maybe thought that, look, guys, 30 years have passed. Let's concentrate on our terrible economy, or let's deal with some of these other, pressing challenges. So I think that he understood some of the pain. What he didn't understand was why people wanted to essentially harp on this issue now, when they could be, making a better future for the Soviet Union.
And they both have a very constructive attitude towards the past, right? That you can use the past in ways to improve society. But that you have to kind of direct and limit the discussion, right?
Exactly. And they both, in effect, still believe in a model where, the party is explaining to you how you ought to understand things. And I would say that's extremely strong under Khrushchev. I mean, Khrushchev has a fascinating personality. He's somebody who considered himself an expert on everything. And so to have the party still being the one that, delivers the definitive understandings of how the world works and what was important about the past is quite normal to him. Gorbachev, again, as you mentioned, is sort of a child of the 20th Party. He was a young person during the thaw when there were, sort of fascinating, challenging literary works being published and discussion clubs and so forth. He embraces that more. So he is more open to pluralism and a plurality of voices. But I think he, too, is really only able to act because he thinks at heart that the majority of the people share his desire for an improved socialism. And that does not turn out to be true.
Maybe his openness is a product of being part of that generation. So openness is confidence.
Yeah. And I think that, Gorbachev, he came from this rural background, but he was educated in the best university in the Soviet Union, Moscow State University. He went to law school, which was not a very prestigious part of the Soviet education system. But he did his senior thesis on, Western parliamentary regimes and what was wrong with them, right? But so even though he was writing about what was wrong with them, from a Soviet perspective, you see somebody who is curious about foreign countries, who's interested in, alternatives, and who's very curious. And I think he does carry that with him and make policies that reflect an expectation that educated people do want to know more, do want to be, trusted to be able to voice their own opinions and so forth.
So, I mean, one of the most dramatic changes that's happening, right? And it doesn't happen right away. You have millions of people that are still lingering in these prison camps, this sprawling network of prison camps. And it's not like they just get released after Stalin dies, right? It takes the new regime is not just struggling how to come to terms with the past and who to blame, but it takes them 3 years, right, before they really address this population.
Part of Khrushchev's motivation is that, like other members of the elite, many people from his, circles were arrested and sent off to the Gulag. And so after Stalin's death, people with the best political connections are immediately writing letters, from their places of imprisonment to their most famous contacts saying, that I'm innocent, like, help me out. And so some of Khrushchev's close contacts are rehabilitated legally. They're allowed to return to Moscow. And it's very difficult for him to meet with them. But they all say the same thing. You have to do something. You can't leave it like this. And the longer you take to do it, the harder it's going to be for you to explain. Right? So there is pressure from former prisoners to have a more systematic approach to releasing survivors and rehabilitating them. And after Khrushchev makes the secret speech, this is something I write about in Moscow 1956, he forms these commissions that include one rehabilitated high-ranking party member, so somebody who's been in the camps, who's been purged, and a prosecutor, and some other. They need 3 people to be part of this. They send them out to Siberia, everywhere, and they conduct a review of all the prisoners in every camp. And so lots of people are released in that moment. But all that is done behind the scenes. It's not written about in the press.
That's how you control it, right? That's how you control the treatment of the past or control the narrative. Even though you're addressing the release of millions of people, it has to be done in a discreet way.
Yes. And ideally, those prisoners should understand 2 things: that they should be grateful for the party for releasing them. And secondly, that it is better not to speak of such things. So you get this return to life, but it's a return still to this stunted life. You're not going to get a medal, you're not necessarily going to get your old job back, right? So it's it's a partial restoration, but it's very painful for people because, again, we talked about that stigma. They would like to have their names cleared. Some famous figures get that.
This is one thing I guess I'm struggling a little bit to understand. You have the release, right? You have, like you said, these traveling commissions go out. It takes 3 years. Finally, in 1956, that's the year that you have the prison camps that are emptied and millions of people return home. But then you have rehabilitation, which is something totally separate, correct? Am I understanding this correctly? And where the state moves much more slowly, a much more limited process.
Right. So these commissions go out, and often what they do is they like shorten the sentence or they amnesty you. So you're free to go. But that's not the same as saying you were innocent, right? It just says there's no point in holding you any longer. So to get legal rehabilitation, you have to appeal to the prosecutor's office. And the prosecutor's office is overwhelmed, right, by all these claims. And initially, they're looking like case by case. Before 1956, they're looking to see, well, are there surviving witnesses? Are people recanting their testimony? Or let's find the secret policeman who did the interrogations. Oh, he was purged himself. Well, what are we going to do then? So the state didn't want to make mistakes and somehow, pardon or, rehabilitate people who were in fact anti-Soviet or criminals or so forth. After 1956 in the secret speech, the process is definitely expedited, but it definitely doesn't apply to everyone. And not everyone even asks for rehabilitation because it means drawing attention to yourself, having more contact with official agencies. Some people prefer to try and, melt back into their surroundings. So again, when we talk about like numbers, there are numbers we can see for how many people are rehabilitated in a given year. And sometimes we can see how many of those are posthumous, how many of those are survivors. But it certainly doesn't encompass all the victims, especially those where there's no one left to appeal for them, right? So if you have a whole family essentially that was purged or, whose survivors died during World War II, there's no one left to say, hey, let's look into Uncle So-and-so's case. Let's ask that he be rehabilitated. So yes, it's a very complicated issue, the returnees and how they return and who applies for rehabilitation. And some of the big famous victims, people who were, colleagues of Lenin who became subjects of the show trials under Stalin, those people aren't rehabilitated until the Gorbachev era. That's just like too politically sensitive. The regime won't do it.
I love you had one example that you gave about how murky that process of rehabilitation was, that when people were summoned, they thought they were going to be sentenced all over again. Right? This fear of what was going to happen.
Yes, the sad story of the guy who shows up, he's got his bag packed, he's wearing his, his winter coat and his boots, because if the prosecutor summons you, then that just probably means like you're going, as the Russians say, on another tour of the camps. So, you have to be ready. But yeah, it's definitely an atmosphere of fear, even after the secret speech.
Maybe the key point, like you said here, is that there wasn't maybe the expectation of justice. People were happy to be released. Maybe you have to wait 30 years for demands to increase. And maybe it has to move on to the next generation. Maybe the first generation is still traumatized and is just happy to be free.
I think that's really well put. That one can imagine that people's expectations were pretty limited after what they had been through. Yeah. And again, especially when they look at the party and they, there's no, 1956, you could think like, now that would have been a moment to purge the party. You could purge the people who like went along with all these terrible repressions and so forth. But that's not what happens, right? The people at the top of the party, for the most part, don't really change. So I don't think that inspires a lot of confidence in people who are released from the gulag to think that, oh, now I can go and they're going to want to hear my whole story and they're going to want to truly help me out.
You mentioned there's an initial attempted commemoration, right? Khrushchev is really the first one to propose the idea of a memorial. Maybe it doesn't come from him, but he backs it at this early stage, and maybe nothing ever comes of it. But to get at the repercussions of the repressions and the trauma of the people. I thought it was interesting your point that the proposals that come out at that time, it's almost like people can't even grasp the the entirety of what had happened, right? It's filtered on individual level, right? In terms of the proposals for how you commemorate it.
Yeah, I think that again, the amount of openness about, say, the extent of the purges was very limited still under Khrushchev. And so you're right, when people tried to think of like, well, how would you commemorate this? What's the appropriate thing to do? I think there was kind of a lack of imagination. Now, Khrushchev did say, that essentially we should build a monument to the innocent victims of Stalin's repressions. Some people didn't like that word innocent because it sort of implied like, oh, well, not everybody who was arrested was innocent, right? So again, maybe these are just the people the regime rehabilitates who are going to get this treatment. But I will say what Khrushchev actually does is kind of the antithesis of building a monument. So there's no monument to victims built in this time period. But what does happen in 1962 after the 22nd Party Congress, when there's another sort of burst of anti-Stalin speech, is they remove Stalin's body from the mausoleum. So Stalin had been put into the Lenin Mausoleum in 1953, which was a place of sort of pilgrimage by, true believers, children's school groups, and so forth. But quietly, in the middle of the night, they take him out in 1962 and change sort of the inscription on the mausoleum back to just being the Lenin Mausoleum. So, that's kind of a demotion for Stalin. But they bury him nearby in the Kremlin wall, and there's sort of a discreet, small sort of pillar with a small bust of Stalin that is put up there. So I think that kind of symbolizes the fact that, it's not that they say everything about Stalin was bad, but they just sort of, put him farther away from Lenin.
And it seems like this aggressive period of aggressive de-Stalinization, maybe it becomes more possible to publish accounts of what happened. I mean, is it that the period where you just get more literary accounts that come out?
Yes, and so in the book I talk about, for instance, the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and this is the most famous literary work about Stalin's repressions. And it is written by a man who himself had been a prisoner. He was arrested in the midst of his service in World War II because of some incautious things that he had written in letters to friends of his. And he, served a fairly long sentence in the Gulag for that. And so Solzhenitsyn wrote this novella where he created a fictional character who was a former peasant, a sort of Soviet everyman. And the book described a day in his life and the kind of people that were around him in the camps, people who had been arrested for various, sort of bad reasons and so forth. And the story goes that Khrushchev approved of this novel and became a big supporter of it because what he liked about the main character is that he was a hard worker and an honest person. So it describes, how he spends his day, laying brick as part of, a forced labor brigade and so forth. But, essentially, continuing to be a responsible, hardworking person, being kind of that ideal of the Soviet worker, albeit, in this terrible circumstance. So that novella, which is published by a literary magazine, becomes like the sensation of the decade and is really the high point of openness, I would say, about the purges.
Maybe you can use that book because it features this horrendous past, but it does so by focusing on the nobility of the people.
Yes. And because this worker is not thinking about whose fault is this, like what should be done? It is very much a snapshot of a prisoner's life and not some kind of, critical assessment of the whole system. Now, ironically, Solzhenitsyn, as I'm sure your listeners know, goes on to write the Gulag Archipelago, a 3-volume sort of history of state violence and forced labor in the Soviet Union. But that was not the book that you put forward, in 1962, if you want to get published.
In the years following the death of Stalin, Soviet leaders were divided about how to remember the past. Fearful of the charges that might be raised against them, conservatives preferred silence as the safest way forward. Liberals called for a clean break with the past through more truth-telling, justice, and institutional reform. Khrushchev tried to stake out a middle ground by denouncing Stalin's terror while casting the party as Stalin's greatest victim. While Khrushchev's thaw allowed for some degree of constructive criticism, there was no support for raising fundamental questions about state institutions or identifying the perpetrators of past crimes. Next month, tune into the second half of my interview with Kathleen Smith in part 2 of this episode. Find out how a dissident movement took up the torch of truth-telling and battled with the conservative Soviet regime determined to put a lid on the past. Find out how Gorbachev's failed efforts to save the Soviet Union unleashed a firestorm of popular memory work. Find out why Kathleen Smith describes the grassroots memory work of this period as a missed opportunity to put the newly created Russian Federation on a more solid democratic footing. I would like to extend my deepest thanks to Kathleen Smith for participating in this episode. I'm especially grateful to Kathleen for her patience as I work through the kinks of a new recording system. If you've enjoyed this episode, please recommend it to a friend and review us on your favorite podcast app. I'm your host, Rick Dadarian. Thank you for listening to Realms of Memory.